Good morning to all our colleagues in Korea. I acknowledge very much for your invitation to be with you, celebrating this International Museums Day in this year. And my presentation will address specifically the theme of this year International Museums Day. I will share my screen immediately after and hope to be clear in my ideas, which are not often black and white. We have to learn to understand that often reality is has a lot of color tones, and that's the idea I have in mind now, is to raise problems more than, or questions, or motives for reflection more than answers. So let's proceed with my presentation. Thank you again very much. Well, I hope you are now seeing my presentation. And as you see, the title itself takes the theme of this year International Museums Day, the future of museums in rapidly changing communities. And that's my intention, to make a tour d'horizon, as it is said in French, a general view on this theme, which is so vast and so wide that a lot of possible avenues could be followed. Well, when we think about the museums and the future of museums and the concepts related to the museums, a lot of words arise to our minds: future, collaboration, social impact, digital, accessible, rethinking, and so on and so on. This is a cloud of possible words which arise to our minds when thinking about the future of museums in rapidly changing communities or societies. And I will follow my presentation according to several major questions or motives for reflection. The first question, or the first line of reasoning, is this one: what professionals think museums can come to be in the future? Well, to answer this question, there is a lot of literature, a lot of papers, already published papers, conferences, and so on. I take here only one possible avenue to think on this issue: the project, the Future of Museums project. What will museums be like in the future? This project has already one decade, maybe about or more ago, but is still possible to be found in internet. There is the internet address to reach this project. And from that project, I take a few possible ideas or definitions put it forward by professionals when asked about the future of museums. And you will see they are very diverse. For instance, some people say that museums, diversity will increase in museums and helping to establish a sense of ownership. Some others say that museums are not just buildings. They are meant to building society, to building community. They should be more and more accessible, agile and distinct, controversial, flexible and fluid, transparency, authenticity and participation, engaging audiences more deeply. And these kind of ideas about the future of museums continue. I have only selected a few of possible avenues of thinking. They should be, for some colleagues of us, professionals of museums, I mean, entrepreneurial and creative. Some others warn ourselves about the dangers of short-term activities and goals. They say museums are forever, so remove the short-term pressure. They should be hubs of engagement. They shall retain their sense of public service. Museums also as youngest learners classrooms, and the whole museum's business should be reconsidered. So here you see very different ways of thinking the future of museums by professionals. It is not usual for us to begin such a speech by thinking or by mentioning what professional thinks. We usually tend to dive directly to publics, but we will reach that. But I prefer this time to begin with our own reflections on the subject. The second question I have selected to present you is what museums are in fact today. After seeing what professionals think they can be, they can come to be, what are they museums in fact today? Well, and to begin with, museums are really a business model, a business system. They generate a lot of economy from all around the world. Figures exist, some of them very precise, some others not so much. But for instance, these ones from UK shows that museums are generators of billions of pounds of income in economy. Not only by tourism, but for locals, economy by locals, I mean. In the United States of America, in the USA, the same observation is made by the American Alliance of Museums, saying that economy loves museums. And in fact, there are figures all around the world pointing out to this. Here, for instance, is an article, a press news work done by The Economist more than one decade ago, when they preview for the decade which is now finishing, the most important museums projects in the world, and the amount involved in that is really fantastic. And as you see, they are in Europe, as traditionally museums are. Most museums still today are European, but also in America, North American in general, and Asia. And China here takes a very, very important role. The number of museums in China solely, the increasing in museums is absolutely amazing yearly. And so from here, it derives the idea of museums as an important social partner to economy and also, of course, to other domains of museums participation in social life. These are also the ones, of course, relating to the sense of culture identity. In America, again, in USA, the American Alliance of Museums has yearly what they call the Museums Advocacy Day, when they present what they also call museums facts to society, and in very much directed to political decisors. For instance, they say in one of their brochures that museums serve public, museums are trustworthy, museums are popular, museums educate communities, museums partner with schools, museums serve every community. And this is what makes museums a very strong cultural entity all around the world. Maybe the widest one, the most democratic one in the sense, because it exists all around the world, from big metropolis, big towns, up to small, very, very small villages and communities. From here, we can proceed to another question. What museums will maybe ever be? Well, here I take the definition of ICOM, which gives us a solid frame to observe what museums are, were, are, and maybe will ever be. And I did myself this model, taking the museum's definition of ICOM as the basis for it. Taking the definition of the ICOM definition of museums as basis, I said we can consider that it establishes 4 big domains for the definition of museums. Museums nature, museums function, museums goals, and museums scope. Museums nature, well, the definition of ICOM has several characteristics defining museums: non-for-profit, institution, permanent, in the service of society, open to public, accessible and inclusive, participatory, and these new dimensions which have been added in the new definition adopted some years ago: ethical and professional. This is the nature of being a museum. And then the function of museums is to research, collect, conserve, interpret, and exhibit. What are museums supposed to research, collect, and so on? Well, the scope of museums: tangible and intangible heritage. And finally, which purposes, which goals: education, enjoyment, knowledge, reflection, knowledge sharing. So maybe we can anticipate that this is what museums will ever be. And I would myself personally like to add another dimension to this definition: social or community empowering. Museums, in my view, are already today and will be increasingly in the future devices for social or community empowering. Also, taking from the ICOM definition other ideas developed in this case by myself, I consider museums as a very diverse field where different ways of being museums can be accepted and considered. A museum is maybe the ideal museum, is a museums of, I would name it a museums of contexts, which is located in the center of two axes. One, the vertical one, is more related to collections, to objects, and it goes from the cabinet of curiosities, which is not a museum, is an ancestor of museums, up to the research center, which is not also a museum, is already outside the field of being museum. Inside the field of being museum, along this axis, we can have at the bottom the classic and traditional museum of objects, and at the top, close to the research center, the museum of the viewpoint. They both are museums with different emphasis on the different characteristics of being museum. And then an horizontal axis linking people to museums. Outside the field of being museum, in one extremity, we have the archive. An archive is not really a museum. It's different. Of course, an archive has objects, books, for instance, or other objects, but it lacks the dimension of really focus on public and educational services. And then outside, also in the other extremity of this X, the field of being museum, outside it, the thematic park. Thematic parks are not also museums. They are not museums at all. They are much more devoted to amusement, they can be educative also, of course, but in a different way of museums. Museums are anchored and are extremely dependent on real objects, real collections, and not on reconstitutions of environments of the past. Inside the field of being museum, along this axis, we have close to archives the museum temple, and close to the thematic parks, the museum forum. They both are museums, ways of being museums. So the field of being museum is very, very vast, wide, and a lot of different ways of being museum can be considered inside it. Also, another dimension of being museum, which I think stands for the future, and we are still trying to answer to the question, what museums will maybe ever be, don't forget this, is this way of considering the basic functions of museums. It's what I call the three-pillar conception. A museum like a bridge over troubled waters, a bridge with three pillars. the educational and the dissemination pillar, the central pillar, the curatorship pillar, and then also the research pillar. Without any of these three pillars, the bridge would collapse, and museums would cease to be really museums. According to this model, as you see, objects from life, from real life, enter in the bridge, becoming museums objects by research. And then in the opposite side of the bridge, people, communities can enter in the museum, becoming museums visitors, museums users. I prefer the term museums users because in many times the users of museums are not really visitors. And they join with objects already turned into museums objects. And there is this combination of museums objects, real museums turned in museums objects, with people turned into museums users, is this combination which makes the nature of museums and the bridge stand. Research in museums is not any research. Here I refer briefly the specific nature of research in museums, which is different from research in universities, in research centers, in a society in general, because it's a research oriented by objects, by collections. Also, curatorship in museums is different from curatorship in other domains of social life. And finally, education dissemination in museums has also specific characteristics which are there mentioned. I will not repeat what you are seeing because, of course, anyone after can return back to this register and read with time what is there written. Finally, from this conception, this three-pillar conception, we could summarize it with a quotation took from a very seductive and provocative book from Stephen Cohn. The title itself is provocative in the good sense of the word, of the phrase. Do museums still need objects? And the conclusion of the author is that, of course, museums still need objects, even in this digital society. And one of his synthesis is this one, this quotation here, which I took from there. Museums are places located in the intersection of objects, ideas, and public space. And museums also, we have to consider them as maybe the most complete social device to promote culture, heritage, knowledge, historical knowledge in society. Because you see, you have there several devices, museums, thematic park, interpretative center, commercial gallery, show, lecture, leisure activity, workshops, school, and then the different characteristics of museums, different goals, nature, functions, according to the ICOM definition. And only museums fulfill the complete set of those characteristics. Maybe the only one where museums are not so strong as others possible, like thematic parks, is the use of replica, of copies, because museums are by nature the domain of the authentic, of the original. Another question, according to my exposition, what visitors expect museums to be? Well, this would maybe be the first question to put if I were to follow another presentation model. But it is also very important to, in a sense, is maybe the most important to think what visitors expect museums to be. And if we take this, we have several possible avenues of thinking, a lot of data. I take here three or four inquiries made to visitors in different countries in the world on why are they visiting museums? The reasons to visit museums. For instance, here in the UK, the reasons to visit museums are the ones which we can anticipate all around the world. Take children, spare time, holiday program, come and gain, specific event, children request, general interest, just passing, subject temporary exhibition, studies, research, museums facilities, meet friends, no reason. So these are the general and universal, I dare to anticipate, reasons to visit museums. Here, for instance, again, we found more or less the same reasons to visit museums. Subject, cost, pricing, invited by friends or family, recommendation by friends, and so on and so on. So these are the really global motives to visit museums all around the world. And of course, we professionals of museums, we have to take this very much into consideration. But if we came to another continent, another area, for instance, here in Indonesia, the reasons to visit museums: exhibited collections, for the most, insignificant number also because of architecture and design, and I will return to this a bit later. Location. Location is very important to facilitate the visiting to museums. Facilities. Facilities like coffee shops, internet availability, and so on. And also to be there. The icon, the sense of icon, to visit a museum because it is important to be there and to say to family, to friends, I have been there, I saw that or that one masterpiece. In France, for instance, to finish with this tour, two museums, two areas, two towns in south of France, Aix-en-Provence and Marseille, and the reasons to visit museums in those two cities, towns in France, are quality of collections, clearness of exhibition themes, pedagogic quality, variety of exhibitions, and comfort. And then in Marseille, almost the same order. And note, please, that comfort is the last reason. Of course, comfort is fundamental to museums. Museums shall be places of comfort where good common areas exist to rest, to take a coffee, to get good sunshine in a terrace, and so on. But those comfort dimensions are not really the very most important reasons to visit museums. Let's not be misleading on this. The most important reasons to visit museums were, are, and will ever be, I believe, collections. The quality of collections and exhibitions. The quality of exhibitions. Now, since we are talking about collections, objects, and exhibitions, a few words about digital, because it is often said that in our world, dominated by digital, maybe museums will have to change their nature, to attribute much more emphasis to digital representations than to real objects. Well, I think this is completely wrong. And these images of museums where digital takes the lead in many cases are really a nightmare for museums. You see the crowd, the amount of crowd, the disinterest in objects themselves is something which museums, which I think is the opposite of the mission of museums. And there is also another dimension, another danger dimension, which is not usually referred in digital, which shall put us museums professionals in prevention relating digital. Because contrary to the common sense perception, and this is data from UNESCO, digital divides. UNESCO is very much emphasizes very much this idea that digital divides because of the different conditions of access to internet, digital divides because of the costs and the existence or not of wideband. 75% of world population has no access to wide internet band, and about half of the human population, world population, has not access of internet at all. So maybe this will change with the futures. This is changing, of course, but digital is not so democratic as it is usually said, including inside one continent and rich countries. For instance, in Europe, the differentiation to access to internet between rich and poor countries is 1 to 3. 3 times less in less richer countries than in richer countries. So let's be prudent about the impact of internet and digital in general in museums, in the sense of democratization of the museums. And also, there is another dimension of the digital and internet which is very puzzling, is what we can name with its names sometimes, the keyboard activism, the hedonist and individualist way of behavior behind the keyboard, where everything can be said without directly confronting himself, herself with others' opinions, and with reality, in fact. So also this internet or keyboard activism is to be very much looked with a lot of caution, and in a sense is opposite to the museum's way of behave and act socially. And it remembers me these dangers of digital and internet, remembers me a lot the book of Umberto Eco, Travels in Hyperreality. It's a voyage of Umberto Eco into deeper rural America, USA, where he saw a lot of museums repeating each other, representing each, for instance, the Last Supper of Leonardo more than 1,000 times. And in one of those places, one of those museums, the idea, put it forward when representing another reproduction of the Last Supper of Leonardo was this idea in yellow here. We are giving you the reproduction so you will no longer feel any need for the original. Well, when we arrive to this sentence and to this conception, we are really speaking about the contrary of being a museum. Museum is by nature the place where we are confronted with the original and not with the reproduction. And Umberto Eco goes further in a more global sense, saying that in these museums or pseudo-museums, the complete real becomes identified with the complete fake. Absolute unreality is offered as real presence. And again, this brings us old ideas about the novel of Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, where he anticipated a world where reality was not really needed. People are happy. They get what they want, and they never want what they can't get. So they are served with artificial information, data. The difference between truth and fake is not so much important. The important is to fulfill possible and to create new needs and fulfill them is the basis at the end, is the basis for any dictatorship regime. And the idea that digital is really the future for museums, it's also a very misleading idea. You see here, if we take the Google search, worldwide Google searches in Google, we see that only during the pandemics of COVID-19, the search for virtual museum has been much more important than the search for museum near to me. Only that moment of the pandemics, when people could not travel and go out to street. Then now, for instance, in these days, it is much more searched in Google. It's much more Googled, the search for museum near me than virtual museum. What really makes people be interested in museums is to try to find museums near them and to visit them physically, I mean. Also, another dimension related to all this matter on the nature of museums and what people want from museums, what people expect, and the opinions of the people about museums, is this very important inquiry by the American Alliance of Museums on trust, museums and trust. Is an inquiry made 4 years ago, 3 to 4 years ago, and is very, very instructive for us. To begin with, they conclude that this is an inquiry made to the global American population. They conclude that museums are one of maybe after family and friends, the most trustworthy institution. Even more than researchers and scientists and so on, up to government, central government, and corporation and business and social media. Social media, of course, is the less thirsty institution in this inquiry. But then, why museums are so trustworthy? Well, the reasons are maybe puzzling for many of us, because they are not related with very complex and very ideas of museums not being naive, museums not serving different viewpoints, museums as arena for discussing hard issues and so on and so on. No. What people consider as important and what people, reasons conducting people to consider that museums are trustworthy are at the end very simple. The first one, museums are fact-based. The second one, museums present real, original, authentic objects. And then it continues, museums are research-oriented, museums offer independent and objective information, museums allow people to draw their own conclusions, so museums are not impositive. Museums are non-partisan, neutral. You know, neutrality doesn't exist really in a society. We know that. We know that. But there are different ways of not being neutral. And museums are the most neutral possible way of presenting information, or they should be. And that's why they are trustworthy. Of course, there is a notion, a lot of space to be fulfilled still in the relation between museums and community society in general, because there are museums attenders, museums intenders, people open to persuasion, to visit, to dialogue with museums, but then there are a lot of resistors and even rejectors of museums. And in many countries, let me very frankly admit that rejectors and resistors are maybe most part of people. And museums are still very elitist. Now, another question, what in museums attract urban entrepreneurs? As I said earlier, as we saw already earlier, museums are very important economic partners. Some visitors in some countries take the architectural dimension of museums as a motive to visit them, to go to a specific town, because there is a museum with an icon in the architectural sense. So let's observe this also. Museums are considered as projects with economic impact deserving to be promoted. more and more. You see here the number of new projects of museums, new museums built from nothing, new buildings, new museums from scratch in recent years. And the increase is very significant. There is every year more and more museums creating from new. And often, maybe already hundreds of times, with very exquisite, very special architectural projects. We can say that today, star architects especially, have learned that to have a museum or more than one museum in his career is a very important, prestigious dimension for him, for her. So museums are like mushrooms. New architects, new museums, buildings are emerging like mushrooms all around the world, and increasingly in these recent years. Here are some. This is taken from Ash Daily, the most important architecture site where these projects are presented. Some others, you see a lot of them all around the world. And this evolution to new buildings, new very shining architectural buildings for museums is often called the Guggenheim effect, because Guggenheim in Bilbao was one of the first ones to follow this path. And the problem here, the thing or the question here is that the Guggenheim effect, now we have time enough to evaluate it, is not so seductive as once we thought about. At the beginning, the Guggenheim Bilbao Museum was important as an icon in town. A lot of people went to Bilbao to visit the museum because it was really very shining, very special. But now, after almost 20 years of time passed, we understood that it was not so positive as it was meant to be. For instance, the economic impact is based on unstable variants like tourism and retail, and very speculative. And with crises which occurred after, it has collapsed a lot, the town itself. And the social inequality and poverty in the town of Bilbao has increased and not decreased after the Bilbao effect took place. So the idea that there is a kind of architect golden ticket, an architectural building able to transform an entire town, is a very naive one. And one has to be very cautious about the real impact, social and economic impact in the long term of these projects. And then there is the most important of all for us professionals of museums, is that these shining spaces are often empty inside. It is common to have not really any program, museologic program, to put inside a very shining building. Is what is named by some authors the architectural schizophrenia. The same outstanding dazzling layouts serving the same inside almost empty spaces. And again, we reach a point where we, museums professionals, we are not at all happy with this. We consider that the first input for a museum is the museologic program, the collections, what really we want to say and which collections we have to serve our purpose in the museum. Is not really the box where the museum is to be put it. That is our first priority when considering the building of new museums. From here, and you see, when referring empty spaces, we began to understand that it can exist a crisis in museums today. In fact, there is a crisis, and maybe several crises, not only one. Let's see very briefly three or four of the dimensions of what can be called the current crisis, or the today's crisis, or in museums. The first one is the commercial abuse of the World Museum. As you know, all around the world, there are surely hundreds, maybe, of museums where the name museum is only a commercial device in order to promote and to attract people. The Museum of Chocolate, the Whiskey Museum, the Museum of Beer, the Museum of Ham. Here are four examples taken from different countries in Europe. But I'm sure that each one of you will remember other examples of so-called museums, which in fact are not museums. And this is one of the dimensions of the crisis, the abuse of the World Museum. The second one is the overcrowding crisis. The immense number of visitors coming to museums, which makes the visiting not so productive as that. Here is Louvre, the Louvre Museum, the most visited museum in the world, in the room of Gioconda. And you see people is there seeing Gioconda not to learn specially anything, but only to register it and to say later on to friends when returning back home that I saw Gioconda, a small painting in a huge room where only with good zoom cameras can we take a photograph of it. So the overcrowd crisis is also another dimension of current crisis in museums. And then the guilty feeling crisis. These are related to things like colonization, decolonization, empowering of communities, programming, sustainability, giving voice to people, to those without voice. So, but one of the most significant dimensions here is decolonization. And museums are often also suffering a kind of guilty sense because they keep still today collections obtained in the past, in last centuries, throughout colonizing dependencies and systems. Also, the very important dimension of one of the dimensions of this guilty feelings crisis is the climate changes in the planet, which is really a very important and dramatic evolution of our times. And as I said to you before, the decoloniality or decolonization issue. But you saw here is a statue of a public space, was not in a museum, which has been destroyed during protests against racism and colonialism. And here we reach a point where in museums, we professionals of museums, we feel not happy with this kind of evolutions. Of course, this statue of Edward Colson in Bristol, after being damaged, has been recuperated and put it for the first time in museums with a new level of evidence. The red color is painting which has been added during these protests. Now it is in a museum as an object with several dimensions of perception. And we are always creating new dimensions of perception of the past. But in my view, it's only my view. I can understand there are different views on the subject. I think it is not at all acceptable that public spaces, nor less the museum's objects, museum's collections, can be subject to this kind of vandalisms. which at the end could spread for almost all statues, almost all personages, because there are almost maybe no sense in public or personages with only virtues in our historical pasts. So, as you see, during this phase of more dramatic phase of vandalism towards public statues, even Immanuel Kant, has been attacked, and also Alexander the Great, and also, of course, Columbus. 490 statues have been damaged only in USA, following the events, the very dramatic and sad events relating George Floyd murder, in fact, murder. And this is not acceptable at all, in my view. And I cannot make a clear distinction from the doctrinary or conceptual or in principle point of view. I cannot divide these protests and these effects of destroying statues from other ones which are conducted more in with a religious fanatism, like the destruction of the well-known destruction of the Buddha of Gautama in Afghanistan by Taliban. Then another dimension of the crisis in museums, today's crisis in museums, is the hedonistic showbiz and emptiness crisis. You know, this photograph here is very common in museums. People, youngsters in many cases, which are in museums, in some cases conducted by school visits to museums, but they don't care at all about what museums have to offer. On the contrary, they are plunged completely in their mobiles, phones, in a very individualistic, hedonistic, and at the end empty way of behave and consider life in general. It's the opposite of those people, like in the small photograph below, looking at the painting and trying to establish empathic relations with the artwork. So, and one has always to remember, and I have here a quotation of one of our most important founding fathers in museums, Georges-Henri Rivière, who said in his Principles of Museology, or La Museologie, the success of a museum is not measured by the number of visitors it receives, but by the number of visitors to whom it has taught something. To taught something is really the objective of a museum. It's not so many to increase the number of visitors. It's not to have that kind of youngsters only linked to mobile phones without learning at the end nothing from the museum. Another question, we are reaching the final part of my presentation. What to do so to get good museums after all this traveling? Well, first thing to have good museums derives from what I said already before when I referred to architecture. Before architecture, before thinking on the building, we have to plan the museum. What the programming and the collections, we have to program in a sense. We have to plan what we want from our museum. Permanent exhibitions, which permanent exhibitions, temporary exhibitions, which temporary exhibitions, the centrality of each in our museum, and we can build models, abstract conceptual models, deriving from our programming. Those models, like the one which is here, which I built for the museum which I was directing at the moment, those models, they can be used by architects to begin to consider architecture. But let's not change the right order of things. First, programming a museum, and then the building, the architecture, and other dimensions. Another way to have good museums, of course, is to renew the museological strategies. Focus on strategic activities, developing networks and cooperation, creating new relations between museums and territories, promoting human resources and improving professional skills, traveling exhibitions, using and exchanging equipments, displaying collections of museums under renovation in other museums, sharing researchers and other staff, launching projects with the tourism sector, developing shared services and restoration, digitalization, insurance, and more, developing the skills and expertise of museums to assessing, project building, cultural local development. These are all possible strategies to renew our impact in society, and so to have also better and good museums. And as you see, some of them there are relating to cooperation between museums and between museums and other institutions. Well, there are different levels of cooperation. This is taken from a report on partnerships in museums already with 10 years ago. And you see the most evolved, the most complex way of partnership is merging. Merging processes can and are also occurring in museums all around the world, but they are very much problematic. They have virtues and potentialities, because by merging we can integrating missions, we can develop audiences, we can expand our collections, we can unify administration with economic gains, for instance, up to 35% of gains in cost reductions, up to 45% of increasing in visitors, and up to 65% in funding success. So merging can be positive for museums, but it can also be very damaging for museums. It has to be taken into with a lot of cautions. To begin with, because merging can destroy the identity of each museum, each particular museum. Maintaining unique institutional character while integrating missions is a difficult task. And the preservation of identity is often maybe the most critical and central issue for museums when considering merging projects. But also there are problems related team integration, the unemployment because of the reduction of employment. There are legal complexities related to merging. And finally, most of all, merging can conduct to the diminishing of trust in museums. Community trust is critical for museums. And when a museum with a long image, a long identity, disappears by merging with another, this can originate very, very, very important damage in public trust to museums, in relating that particular museums and museums in general. In any case, I think that another dimension for renewal of our museums, for having good museums, is deepening community involvement. But here we have to face very difficult questions. And the questions are, these ones. Are museums to be defined by their social development functions alone or mainly? Shall museums be the most adequate frame or even a possible partner to fight against underdevelopment? What exactly museums are and how to differentiate them, if needed, from other developmental community devices like cooperatives, cultural centers, socio-economic associations, and so on? Why to stick on museums when perhaps other more encompassing frames would maybe easily achieve the same community goals? In sum, who needs museums instead of employment generators or other community empowering devices in economic and social depressed lands? So the idea that museums are to be defined by their social role and the impact they can have in these dimensions can be a dangerous idea. Because all those goals, community development and employment and so on, can be achieved by other social devices, not only by museums. In order to keep relevant, I believe that museums have to stand and to insist on dimensions where they are really specific and no others fulfill the same needs. And these, in my view, are collections curatorship. Collections are really the reason for museums to exist. And of course, with collections, they have to fulfill all those social needs also. Museums are not necessarily the best device to fight for social development and empowering. There is no sense in claiming a sort of messianic or imperialistic view regarding the role of museums in society. Museums are, first of all, memory, collections keepers. But in many cases, museums can and shall act as social developers, and in order to accomplish this, they may to evolve and be redefined. This is particularly so in small communities, especially the ones affected by poverty, immigration, and any other dimensions of social exclusion. In these cases, museums should be part or even lead. Museums can lead this dimension of community empowering and the inherent developmental projects, making their expertise and facilities available for this purpose. Museums are often in the best position to deal with difficult questions. So there is no reason for museums to avoid to deal with difficult questions, to make social activity. On the contrary, museums shall do that. But in order to follow this path, a new frame is needed. And in fact, already occurs in some countries where traditional separated institutions have been merged, given place to new concepts. So keeping traditional in what refers collections, museums have to evolve and to be modern, to be new, including in the relation with other institutions, cultural institutions, I mean. And I finish my speech with this model, which I've been developing the concept for about 1 decade ago. I call it GLAM Plus model. GLAM is the acronym, stands for galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. It has originated in UK about maybe 20 years ago at a pure technical level. The cooperation between those galleries, libraries, archives, and museums to share databases, to have technical capacities in common and things like that. Well, I think it's time to evolve from the technical point level to the more citizen or political, if you want, level. Opening museums and the others, libraries, archives, and museums, to other institutions and to other social needs. And that's why I named this model GLAM Plus. The museum as a component of a tool with variable geometry put it at service of community development. And you see here we have a myriad, a large number of public services, public devices. The ones relating culture and heritage in particular, archive, library, museum, cultural center, or social center if you want, and then others, health service, fiscal service, mail service, coffee, web center, press center, and all these, in my view, should be related, put it in relation to build this GLAM Plus model. in some places, in some villages, in some towns, in some small communities, the museum can be or is, maybe, let's hope so, as professionals of museums, the most important symbolic and material, physical public institution at the service of the community. So the museum has obligations. Museum can and shall lead this GLAM Plus model. The museum can be the central meeting point where people camps, where a library can exist also, a social center can exist, and people camps to have health services, mail service, coffee, and press center to access daily press, for instance. A place anchored in a museum, but with different capacities, which most of them or some of them are not yet today considered as possible to have in a museum. Well, I know about several cases in Europe mainly, where due to recent evolution in society, the strong state has diminished, became very light, and in many villages in countryside, where in 20, 30, 40 years ago, there were health center, for instance, health service, or a mail office, it doesn't exist today. So museums, if the museum in that particular village is really the main institution where people likes to be, wants to go, let's put inside also a mail service. Let's have doctors in medicine consultations once a week, once a month, in a special room which has prepared for that at the museum also. That's my idea, to enlarge the services of museums in order to better fulfill the needs of communities, especially in small village, in small communities. But if in another village is not the museum but the library, the most appreciated and important public service still in existence service, I mean. So let's the museum, the small museum of the village, be linked to the library and also the archive. And there, the health services, the press center could take place. So maybe in the future, museums are to be linked with other cultural and not non-cultural public services. That's okay to me. But if museums are to stand, they have to be museums. They have to be. They have to have their own expertise on collections curatorship, educational services, research on objects and collections. They have to keep these functions. If they don't keep these functions, if they cease to consider their collection as the base, the collections as the basis for their existence, well, maybe they will be condemned to disappear in the future. And of course, that's something we don't want as professionals of museums. So that's my speech. I end it here. I will stop to share my screen. And that's what I had to say to you. I'm sorry if I have been too long. I hope to have been of some utility for you, for a new reflection. And since, as I said at the beginning to you all, I've not really answers. I have much more questions to raise than answers to be given. And because the future, no one knows how it will be. And our societies, as it has said since the beginning, are in a rapidly changing moment. I'm very optimistic and confident about museums, providing that they keep to be museums. Thank you very much for your attention.